Good afternoon and welcome from Washington, D.C. And good evening or good morning to those of you joining from around the world. And welcome to the 18th Maynard Sundman Lecture Series. We have a special lecture today, and I am so pleased that you're able to join us. As you hopefully know, the Smithsonian National Postal Museum reopened to the public on August 27th of this year, and we continue to remain open. So if you have not already visited us, please make plans to visit the museum for the opening of our new exhibition, Baseball, America's Home Run, which opens to the public on April 9th of this coming year. Trust me, you will be amazed. And now it is my true pleasure to introduce Don Sundman. Don is president of Mystic Stamp Company. He served as the longtime chairman of the National Postal Museum's Council of Philatelists and is one of the museum's greatest supporters. He has helped the museum increase its reach and impact, and he has led the museum in so many ways, large and small, visible and behind the scenes. He and his brother David established the Maynard Sundman Lecture Series in 2002 to honor their father Maynard. Maynard Sundman began collecting stamps in 1927, and at the age of 19, started his first philatelic business selling stamps through the mail. His passion for stamps continued throughout his lifetime. The lecture series allows the Sundman family and the National Postal Museum to share this passion with a broader audience by featuring talks by authors and expert philatelists. And now, Don.
Thank you, Elliot. I'm Don Sundman, and welcome. I just want to repeat a little bit what Elliot said about my father, Maynard Sundman. As a boy, he loved stamps and started collecting stamps and selling them to his schoolmates. And after high school, he became a full-time stamp dealer, Maynard Sundman Stamps. He ran that business for a few years and then shut it down after Pearl Harbor. And a few months before Pearl Harbor, he entered the Army. He eventually went overseas to North Africa and Italy. He supplemented his wages with gambling. He played craps, and I guess he won, is the story he told us. He sent the money home to my mother, who saved it, and they were preparing to open another stamp company after the war ended. And so they moved to Littleton, New Hampshire, opened the Littleton Stamp Company. My father was an advertising pioneer, reaching large audiences in national newspapers and matchbooks and things like that. He loved coins too. He eventually changed his name of the company to Littleton Stamp and Coin Company. 1974, he bought Mystic Stamp Company, a competitor that was an old company, and I moved there to manage it. We adopted the Littleton mission, which is to bring the fun of collecting to a wide audience, and we've continued that. And my father loved books in learning and stamps and postal history. And so he would love today's lecture. He was a nice man with a warm smile who wanted more people to discover the fun of collecting. And the Sundman Lecture certainly works in that mission. So I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you very much.
Let me join my welcome to those of Director Gruber and Donald Sundman. I am Dr. Susan Smith, the Winton M. Blunt Research Chair at the National Postal Museum. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to start by thanking my colleague, Kara Nolan, for her assistance with this virtual event. Next, I want to tell you a little bit about today's setup. Our presenter will speak for roughly 30 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer period, so all the Q&A will be at the end. Since this is a webinar, members of the audience will not have use of their cameras or their microphones. You can enter your questions into the question and answer, the Q&A box. You can click down at the bottom of your screen anytime during the talk. You will only be able to see your own questions. I will read through the questions and group them together when appropriate before asking them of the speaker. We will go through as many of those questions as possible before 5 p.m. If you're asking about a specific slide or image, please provide enough information to enable Mr. Grimwood Taylor to identify it. And if you would like closed captioning, you can click on the CC symbol at the bottom of your screen. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, James Grimwood Taylor. James Grimwood Taylor began collecting stamps at the age of 3 and as a teenager developed an interest in pre-stamp covers and began wondering why certain countries introduced stamps earlier than others. After graduating from university, he began his first job in philately in the postal history department of a well-known London dealership. Spent about 10 years there and then decided to become an auctioneer. In 1988, he took over and became the principal postal history describer at Cavendish Philatelic Auctions in Derby, where he had grown up. He sold the firm in 2017 and now works one day a week doing valuations of postal history. Throughout this long philatelic career, he's developed postal history expertise in most areas of the world. He's a member of numerous British and overseas societies, including the Collectors Club of New York and the US and UK Postal History Societies. He is past president of both the Great Britain Philatelic Society and the Society of Postal Historians. He joined the Royal Philatelic Society London when professional philatelists were first admitted in 2005, and he was elected a fellow in 2008. In 2020, he was chosen to sign the Roll of Distinguished Philatelist. Fernmore Taylor has been an accredited national judge since the 1980s and is also a distinguished international exhibitor with 5 international gold medals, including an international large gold medal won in New York 2016 for his postal reforms exhibit. He has authored over 200 research articles, 3 books, and a novel. His 2-volume International Postal Reforms won the 2021 Great Britain Philatelic Society President's Prize and the Crawford Medal from the Royal Philatelic Society London for the most valuable and original contribution to the study and knowledge of philately, published in book form. He recently presented a new 500-page display to the Royal Philatelic Society London called The Postal History of the World, 3000 BC to 1940 AD, and it covers countries from Afghanistan to Zululand, about 125 countries in total. He's also been working on censuses of the earliest letters from various countries in private hands. The National Postal Museum is honored that Mr. Grimwood Taylor had joined us today as the 18th Maynard Sundman Lecturer. His talk is titled The Origins, Birth, and International Reach of the Postage Stamp through 1847. James.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. I'm hoping that people can see me and hear me, and I will be talking in 30 minutes covering, well, maybe 5,000 years of history. So it's going to be a bit fast. And forgive me if I go too quickly, but the idea is to give you a flavor of the subject rather than the whole story. If you want the whole story, you have to buy my book, which has 1,056 pages in it. So that's the alternative, 30 minutes or a bit longer. So I'm going to show you some pivotal items, all from my collection, which are the main points along the way of the story. I can't tell you the whole story in 30 minutes, but some of my favorites, which do sort of point out the most important features. So I'm going to start at the beginning and work chronologically through to the year that a lot of American philatelists consider very important, which is 1847. And I'd like the first slide, please. So we're starting way back with cuneiform. And this is the first letter I have, the oldest one in my collection. And I've put the text up there for you to have a look at. And it's quite interesting. It's very small because they didn't want to carry big weights around, and they were made of clay. Later on, letters are made of paper, which is much lighter, obviously. But the message thus says, Ashurmuttapil, please speak to Kunanaya. Enumile has handed over 10 shekels of silver. And so it goes on. And he speaks as if he was telling someone to tell someone else. And that's what it was. It was the original version was a messenger, and he went and told the person the message. And this very early period cuneiform, they actually wrote down the message, and then it was more certain of being accurately relayed. And we then jump, if we could go to the next slide, please. And this is the beginning of ink writing, at least it's the beginning in my collection. But the Romans were scribbling away on birch bark back in 100 AD, as we've discovered in Vindolanda in the north of England. But this is pretty early on, 1175, and it's a beautifully written document on vellum, which is animal skin. And you probably can't read much of it, but it's in Latin and in a rather abbreviated Latin. But with a bit of practice, you can read it. And there would have been a seal at the bottom, but this would not have been a letter as such. This was a document witnessed by many people. None of them signed it because none of them were literate, but they were mentioned. So if ever there was a question, people could get hold of them and ask them if they'd been there when someone else signed it. Then we jump again, next slide, please, to the earliest period when you can get letters written on paper. So what I'm trying to say is that letters have been around a long time, but the stamps have not. As we will see, stamps come quite late on in the piece. But this again is hard to read. This is the address panel of not an envelope, but a folded up sheet of paper. People didn't use envelopes at that time. They used one sheet of paper, folded it round, and then they would seal it at the back with wax. And you can see the address is the top couple of lines. The next couple of lines lower down are the filing endorsement. And you can see it took 75 days to travel from the island of Crete across to Venice, which is a pretty long time, but I guess the boat was stopping off at a few places. And you can't see many letters now in private hands of the 1300s, but there are a few around. And my hobby has always been to try and get the early, so early as I can for any country. Next slide, please. British material obviously is of interest to me, and I've pursued it for, gosh, 40 something years. And there is a famous correspondence discovered in the 1980s, which is called the Corsini correspondence. You can probably read the word Corsini on the address here. It's addressed to Filippo Corsini in Londra, written in Italian. And so there is a squiggly 4.5, you can probably see that. That was a charge made on delivery, and it was to a merchant. The letter was coming in from Belgium. And so the poor old Mr. Corsini had to pay when he got the letter. It wasn't prepaid by the man who sent it. The theory being in those days that nobody would bother to deliver it unless they had the incentive of getting some money when they delivered it. Not entirely sure that that was the case. But you had a bundle and they were half a groat each. So that's 4.5 groats for a bundle of 9 letters. That shows you what an old letter would have looked like in 1570. And the next slide, please. And you may have heard of our English Civil War. We know about your American Civil War. The English Civil War was in the 1640s. And Oliver Cromwell took over and they chopped King Charles I's head off in 1649. And we had what we called a Commonwealth for a while. And 1655, this is a letter from Edinburgh. And it's beginning to be possible to read the handwriting, maybe. You can certainly read London there, I think. And I folded the letter around so you can see in the side where they've written Sir and Cousin. It was his cousin. Edinburgh is where he wrote the letter from on the 22nd of December, 1655. And that cost 4p to go to London. My apologies for the clock that is striking in the background. So that's the beginning of the British public postal service as opposed to the merchants. The next slide, please. I think stamps were invented in 1840, or possibly 1847, but tax stamps were there for many, many years before that. And the first British tax stamps came in 1694. And this is an example of 1696. And I've enlarged the stamp. The original document on the left is an inventory. And you had to pay tax on any legal document. And somebody in Holland came up with the idea of a stamp to pay for that tax. In 1624, they were the first, as far as I know, to use tax stamps. And it's a fairly small jump between a tax stamp and a postage stamp, because a bit of paper you had to pay money for, and you were using it for some tax, and you could consider postage to be a tax if you like. So maybe therein lies the origin of the postage stamp. And you can just about see V1 pence at the bottom of the enlargement, 6p. That was the cost of the tax on the document. The next slide, please. And in America, you had the same thing. Back in 1755, surprisingly perhaps, I didn't know about these until relatively recently. Again, I've enlarged the tax stamp, which in this case is not stuck on and glued as a stamp, but embossed into the paper. But it still cost some money to do that. And you can see the 1 pence underneath the codfish. And it's rather nice, the inscription that you probably see is staple of the Massachusetts. And that was a codfish, as I understand it. And this was raising tax, just like the British were raising tax. This was for your local war against the French Canadians. And to me, that's the first American stamp. We go on to the next slide, please. Slide, there we go. In Italy, in Sardinia, they came up with an unusual scheme in 1818. The letter at the top left, you can see, has a little round postmark, if you like, and C15 with a horseman. And this was in order to prevent the authorities from arresting someone who was taking your letter. It was an insurance against prosecution for breaking the monopoly of the post office. And you had different amounts for different distances. And the excerpt at the bottom below that, Modelli di Bolli, samples of the marks for the 3 different rates, 3 different distances. Rather nice picture of a horse they incorporated in their postmark. And that was a sort of a postage stamp, as near as you can get. And again, the Italians would say that's the beginning of postage stamps. I say it's another stop along the way to the development of the postage stamp. Most attractive. The next slide, please. Now, I've picked out a few things that speak to the American part of the story. And not everybody knows that the penny black was produced by a chap from Philadelphia. But in fact, Jacob Perkins came from America to print banknotes in England originally. In 1819, he took a ship and brought his very sophisticated printing plates and his engravers. The whole firm moved to London, trying to get the British Bank of England contract for banknotes. They didn't get that, but they got a ton of other work, so they were pretty happy. And this is one of their samples when they were first arrived, and very beautiful engraving. And you can see stamp-like elements. You can see security background, engine turn designs, and obviously profile heads of classical characters, which immediately remind me anyway of postage stamps. And this is way back again in 1819, about the same time as the Sardinian Cavallinis. Slide, please. Now, I'd mentioned that we had postal rates for the merchants back in the 1570s, and then they had a post office from Cromwellian times onwards in England and in America, 1700 odd. And certainly in every case, the postal rates went up, not down, and they went up and up and up in England. And this is the most extreme example that I've encountered. And it makes the point rather neatly that postal rates were out of control. The average letter in England from anywhere to anywhere was 8 pence, which in 1820s, 30s was a lot of money. Most people couldn't afford that at all. If you were unlucky enough to receive a letter, as I said, people paid on arrival. This chap received a very large letter, 83.5 ounces, you can see there at the left, £26, 8 shillings and 10 pence. That was a small fortune, more than a year's wages for most people, most ordinary people at the time. The story behind that I have written up elsewhere, but it was basically a man who just inherited £500,000, which was one of the largest inheritances ever in the 1820s. And he was riding home from America to England to say, yes, thank you very much, I'll have the money, which I could well understand he didn't mind paying, or his lawyer, the addressee, paying such a lot of postage. So that just makes the point. Postal rates were ridiculously high in the 1820s. We move on. Next slide, please. And on your side of the world, in America, you were getting the same problem. As you see here, this was a memorial from Philadelphia in 1836. And basically saying they're complaining that rates should be reduced to those which existed previously to the late war. So the problem was that, as in England, when there was a war on, people put the postal rates up. And when the war ended, they didn't bother to put them down again, which was not really very considerate and caused this great spiral, upward spiral of postal rates. And you can see both sides of the Atlantic have the same problem. And the next slide, please. And this dates to almost exactly the same time as that Philadelphia document. This is Rowland Hill's booklet or pamphlet. And he was inspired by an MP from Scotland to look at the costs of postage. And he was a mathematician of considerable ability. And he came up with this booklet, and he thought he only needed to publish 50 copies, send it to the government and the important people, and they would all agree and put it into law. It was a little bit optimistic, and it wasn't quite what happened, but how shall we put it? It started the ball rolling. And this was privately circulated, 50 copies. He then went public, and the next 4 editions were very, very popular, and a huge campaign began, backed principally by the people who had the most to gain from reducing postage. They were the merchants of London, who sent and received tons of letters from all over the world. And so they put their money into the campaign that basically started from this pamphlet of 1837, written in 1836. And we go to the next slide, please. And that, strangely, was the first result of Rowland Hill's pamphlet. He came up with the idea of a postage stamp and a postage wrapper. And the postage wrapper appealed to the governor of New South Wales in Australia. And he persuaded his post office in Sydney to introduce these special letter sheets in 1838. Nobody's found one of 1838 yet. There's a piece of one in 1839. And if you've got one, please let me know, because I would love to have one as early as that. I have one of 1846 and this one of 1848, but I've had to enlarge the embossed device, which is in the middle next to 6 o'clock, the postmark on this letter, to the left of 6 o'clock. And that was Sydney Post Office, General Post Office, Sydney, it says with the coat of arms. And that meant you'd paid your tuppence and the letter would go anywhere in Sydney for free because you'd paid the local tuppenny rate. That was 1838, before the penny black. And the next slide, please. The merchants employed a man called Henry Cole, who was quite a clever journalist and a bit of an artist, to create some very impressive and sometimes amusing propaganda to inspire people to campaign for cheap postage. So the merchants put up the money. Henry Cole designed the things that were sent out, including a newspaper from which this cartoon comes. And you can see that it was a neat way of saying stamps were ridiculous, letters were ridiculously expensive, because the vast majority of things on a mail coach went free. Newspapers went free, and free francs from the government and MPs, members of parliament, etc., like your congressman, went free, but a few letters cost an enormous amount of money, and that was an actual statistic that they found at the time. And he drew the cartoon from those statistics. On to the next slide, please. And this is a relatively recent acquisition of mine. During lockdown, I was sitting in and looking at an auction, as one does, and waiting for another lot to come up, and this came up. And I'd always admired it, and I wasn't expecting no one else to bid. So I ended up owning it, which is very nice. But it's the earliest pictorial label on a cover. We're not quite sure why the chap stuck it on there, but it was the maiden voyage of the ship. So he perhaps was celebrating. And it is tied by the manuscript 6. So we know that it was stuck on there. And he talks in the letter of visiting the ship and how impressive it was, the steamer, the British Queen. Could say that was a stamp, but obviously not a post office stamp. And the next slide is the same month, July 1839, but this is one of the merchants' propaganda items from Henry Cole. And they came up with the very first attempt at a postage stamp, penny stamp essay. And that's stuck onto this letter at the top left. post office permit, they call it. This one was stuck on a free letter, so it was just Joseph Hume, a famous postal reformer, writing to his wife to show her what it might look like. Inside the letter was a piece of propaganda trying to calm down the wholesale stationers who were worried they'd lose their business if the government printed these wrappers and people wrote their letters on the back of them. And we go on, getting nearer to 1840. This was an example of Charles Whiting, the master printer at the time. He tried to get the job of printing stamps, but he was in a way too good. So the stamps were too expensive by a few pennies a thousand, and he didn't get the contract, which was a great shame. So it's just incredible, the quality of his printing. And you can see the metal from which the design came. And we zoom on because time is running on, I'm afraid. And this takes us into a very brief experiment they had. They wanted to have cheap penny postage. A letter anywhere in Britain for a penny was the plan. They got the members of Parliament to agree, and then they had the problem. Rowland Hill was given the problem of sorting it out, and he said, "Oh Lord, we can't get down to a penny straight away. The whole system will crack up. They'll have too many letters coming in at once, from an average of 8p overnight to a penny." So they went halfway. They went to 4p, and for 5 weeks they had this 4p rate. And some towns went out and bought a hand stamp like that, but it was pointless because 5 weeks later it was a penny and they'd have to throw them away. On to the next slide, please. And there's the penny mark used on the first day of penny postage, which was in fact the 10th of January 1840, the most important date, in my opinion, in British postal history. Letters from the 10th were a penny, half ounce, prepaid anywhere. This one had been sent on the 9th and redirected, so it was the last day of free mail. They got rid of all the MPs' free mail after the 9th of January. And we go on perhaps to the more important one, the next one. And then the 6th of May, 1840, the first day of the first stamp that was in general issue, as in postage label. And this is the penny black on the first day cover, which I acquired 20 years ago when everybody else in an auction fell asleep, I think. I was very excited to get it. And that's the one I would grab if there was a fire and I was running out of the building. And hopefully that won't happen. Let's move on quickly. We now have to the next slide. This was the Americans' illustration of the penny black. It's actually in a Senate paper. And it showed an engraving done by an famous American engraver of the stamp, and the Mulready envelope, that extraordinary design, is a bit too fanciful and the British public didn't like it. It was showing Britannia sending her messengers around the world. And it really was a bit of a political disaster. And on the next slide, you'll see the reaction. That's what the general public thought of it. Well, they bought cartoons in prodigious numbers, Mulready caricatures. This is my favorite, and I think everybody at the time's favorite, John Leech, a great cartoonist. And he upset the man who did the original design because bottom center, you can see a squiggly thing in a circle. And that was the special marking of John Leech. It's supposed to be a leech in a bottle. And Mr. Mulready, who did the original design, thought Mr. Leech was being unkind, but it's actually his surname was John Leech, and he was laughing at himself, not at Mulready. And on we go to the next slide. The tuppenny blue, I think, is more attractive than the penny black, and occasionally letters overseas had them. You needed 6 because you would have needed 12 penny blacks to get to America. This happens to come from my hometown, so again, it was a must-have. But it was I was outbid originally in a friend's collection for many years. Second time around, I was lucky enough to get that. So we have the penny black and the tuppenny blue. They were the first issue with the Mulready letter sheets, which were so unpopular that they were soon got rid of. We move on to the next slide, please. And in New York, you had your own penny post in January or December 39, January 1840. But apparently it was inspired by an Englishman who thought this was a good idea. And so in a way, it was the English doing something in America, as we had with Perkins coming over to England to print the stamps. And they can be quite hard to find. And on to the next one, please. And that was the first postage label used in America. And it's, I think, very attractive. City Dispatch Post. It was local New York mail. And they had that little red box marks as free because, of course, you prepaid your letter. And that was the whole point of all of this reform. If you prepaid it, then the post office didn't have to wait on the doorstep and everything went more efficiently. Less postmen were employed, less man hours, more efficient, cheaper postage. And that was the key to the whole Roland Hill argument. And that's where the postage stamp came from, because it's a prepayment label. And on to the next one, please. I'm now going to show you some pictures from the other countries around the world that got on the bandwagon very early. In other words, before 1847, there weren't very many countries that got postage labels that early. These are the 3 Swiss cantons. My favorite stamp of all is the Bâle Dove, which is in 2 colors. You'll notice most of the other stamps are in 1, but in fact, the Zurich box 6 stamp, that one has thin red lines. You can't see them on this picture. And the Genevans, they wanted 2 colors as well, so they had a green paper with the black. But the Swiss were very, very good. And again, they were inspired by the British. They all used the British sort of penny black as a starting point, except I think Geneva, who decided to have a bisected stamp, which again, I haven't time to go into in detail. On to the next. Brazil. Why Brazil? And that was my whole puzzle when I was looking at this. Why did some countries do it and others didn't? Well, again, there was a chap, a Prussian consul supposedly in Brazil, who got interested in the subject, but he had an English wife and he spent time in England. And we're pretty sure he'd seen the penny black in operation. And he persuaded the Brazilian authorities, who were basically Portuguese government, to do postage stamps. And the bullseye is very, very famous and I think attractive stamp. And again, quite hard to find. Next slide, please. This is a whistle-stop tour in time and geography. We're on now to another American local stamp, which is a very attractive design with an unusual cancellation. So again, I blew it up. You can see the stars, which tell you that it's been used, because that was the other point of this. We had to have a cancellation to stop people reusing their stamps. And the English used a Maltese cross. The Americans had the box free or this design on the locals. And Brazil used the date stamp. Just had a message to say that I'm doing okay on the time. That's reassuring. So we move on, please, to the next slide. And this is Finland. Again, you wouldn't expect necessarily why Brazil, why Finland. Well, I still haven't really figured out why Finland, but it's the Russians were very interested, and Finland was sort of in the Russian orbit. And they were very heavily influenced, and they therefore were right out one of the earliest, and the 1st of January 1845. And weirdly, these early Finnish covers don't often have a date on them. This one has the date written on the back, luckily. So it turned out to be possibly the 2nd or 3rd earliest known usage, which I didn't know when I acquired it. But they had an imprinted envelope, so that Porto-Stample is not a label, it's printed onto the envelope, so it's postal stationery. And they reduced their rates too far, or rather they put them up to start with, and then they had to put them down again. It was all very complicated. But the Finnish stationery lasted quite a long time, and they finally got around to their labels in 1856. Next slide, please. And this is a very strange one. In Indonesia, Batavia, they had a postage due label of a sort. The letters coming in from Egypt, they actually stuck a label on it to emphasize how much postage was needed to be paid on delivery, because it was rather a lot compared to normal letters. So they had these special labels printed, and they filled them in ink themselves before they stuck them onto the letters. So that the chap receiving the letter, he had to pay quite a bit, because not all postage could be paid in advance. It usually could be in the country where it was staying, but if it went abroad, things got very complicated accountancy-wise, and every country wanted a part of the money, and this went from Germany and across Egypt, that's the overland part, and on to Indonesia. And on again, please, the next slide. And we're getting fairly close to the end of the story now. back with America because the Americans were really, really into stamps. We've seen the local ones that were used, and then postmasters were given permission to create their own stamps, which they could sell for the regular postal rate. And it could take the letter anywhere around the country as long as they paid the right rate, 5 cents or 10 cents, 5 cents up to 300 miles for a basic weight letter, which these two were. And one of them is the New York provisional, and that's on a letter that went on to England, which is more unusual, but did the same thing. It was paying the essential 5 cents. And certainly the Baltimore to New York 5 cent rate was correct. And that's the Baltimore provisional. And I rather wish we'd had these in England because they are such fun and so attractive. And the English penny black, penny red are quite nice, but I prefer these. On to the next one, please. And here we are with the Russians in St. Petersburg. They produced these postal stationery envelopes. So you bought the envelope intact, and you had to pay a bit extra for the envelope. So postage was 5 kopek and another kopek for the actual envelope, which is fair enough. Similar to the Mulready was a penny farthing, a penny for postage and a farthing for the actual Mulready. And I haven't been able to capture a used one. So if anyone's got a spare used one, I'd be very happy. I tried to get one used in the first year for whatever issue it is. On to the next slide, please. The Lady Macleod in Trinidad, there was a very enterprising local shipping line, just went up and down the coast, not that large a distance. And the governor was Macleod, and so the chap named his ship after the governor, the Lady Macleod, the governor's wife. And we don't know where they were printed. We don't know who engraved it. Lots of mysteries. It didn't last very long, and it was only for letters going up and down the coast. So this one correspondence, Alexander Taylor, nearly all the letters that have been recorded come from that correspondence. And it's a very popular stamp, but again, it was a local usage. A lot of these early stamps were local usages, and then it was easy because all the rates were the same. It was just the local rate. And so we now come to the final slide, which brings you up to, in fact, we're already in 47, but the US 1847 issues. And they're very similar to the British. We've got a head, and we've got the 2 values, 5 cent, 10 cent. We have the penny black, tuckney blue, and then the penny red. Similar type of design of stamp. So you can see a lot of influence of the basic head of a human being, if you like, being the postage stamp. Not always, as we saw in Brazil and elsewhere. But I like particularly the one at the top left because it's addressed to the Smithsonian. And there's a long story I've written about this in my book, but it's from my, who was a great collector, and it's a souvenir I got from his collection, and Harvey Mirsky. It shows a stamp which was creased before it was printed. So there was a crinkle down the middle of the stamp, and then when they stuck it on, it flattened out, so the stamp got wider, and the postmark goes across the sort of gutter down the middle of the stamp. That's interesting. It was underpaid. That's interesting. It was a penny post in Boston, so you had to pay extra for another stamp to get it in the local mail to start with. And the nicest thing of all, it was going to Professor Jewett, who was the first librarian of the Smithsonian, but not actually to him. If you look to the left of Professor C.C. Jewett, you'll see for Mrs. J. And this was for his wife, because you weren't allowed in those days, the proper thing, you couldn't write to a married woman. You had to write to the husband and put a little note saying it's for the wife. So technically, Professor Jewett could have opened the letter and read it himself. One likes to think perhaps he didn't. Meanwhile, the other one shows you the 10 cent, which again was for a longer distance. In Britain, the postage rate was the same, whatever the distance, but we didn't have the long distances you have. There was no 3,000 miles in Britain. So I think that will show you what I've tried to give a flavor of a much bigger subject, which took me 1,000 pages to do in print. And hopefully some of you might want to pursue that and find the book. I think it's now available in America. We've got 250 copies are printed, 50 copies remain. We haven't launched it yet because it was meant to be launched at London 2020. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, James. We have a lot of questions, so let me go ahead and answer one of them that came in. The answer is yes, this presentation will be available at the National Postal Museum's website sometime early next year, and you will find it under the Sunman Lecture page if you look at the research links at the top of the Postal Museum's website. So yes, this will be available in the future. Thank you for asking. So where to beginning? I guess the first question, you had talked about the commercial aspect of people hoping for cheaper postage. And in your writings, you refer also to people's expectations that there would be moral benefits to having postage stamps and cheaper postage. Can you talk a little bit about what those moral benefits would have been? Oh, you're on mute.
Not much point if I'm not able to be heard. Let's try again. Yes, it was very much Rowland Hill's dream that with cheap postage, that was the key to it. Cheap postage meant that everybody could write letters. So there were many cases of servants and poorer people who had to leave home, go across the country, live somewhere else, couldn't afford to write home. People didn't hear from them for years when it was 8p a letter. But when it was a penny a letter, yes, it would. And again, Rowland Hill, he goes in some detail about this. He reckoned morally this would be very useful.
And then, was there organized opposition to cheap postage and the rise of the postage stamp in the 1840s, or even to the ideas when they're put forward a little bit earlier?
The opposition really initially came from the wholesale stationers, the people who sold writing paper. They were in a real panic because they thought that if the Mulready took off, which was the postal stationery, the wrapper, you bought the whole piece of paper and wrote your letter on the back of it, and that was a stamp as well. And Rowland Hill was convinced they were going to be the thing. Nobody was going to bother with the sticky label. He thought they were a side issue. How wrong can you be? And with the result that millions of them were destroyed because nobody bought them. But the stationers, well, they whipped up quite a big campaign against cheap postage and said this was a waste of money. The revenue would be damaged, so it would be bad for everybody. They were totally wrong. Nobody listened to them. And in the end, they didn't mind because nobody bought them Mulreadys. Perhaps because it was they who produced the caricature cartoons. It was the various stationers who were going to lose their livelihoods.
Okay. And can you speak to the point that early American stamps for what we now consider mail or personal or business letters were primarily to raise revenue for the government in excess of actual delivery costs, or to simply cover the costs of the service provision?
Yeah, there was a difference of view between, for instance, the Americans and the British, that the Americans' primary aim, supposedly, was to cover costs. And it was not so much a revenue raising event, but obviously, as we saw earlier on, they were raising their tax for the wars back in the 1750s, using tax stamps and all kinds of things. But the post office, it was a slightly different animal to the British one. There were such huge distances in America, so many offices, that covering their costs was as much as they were going to manage. In Britain, there were all kinds of crazy things in the early period. The king had illegitimate children and mistresses, and he settled the revenue from the post office on his mistresses. So right through to the 1850s, the British post office had to fund the descendants of Charles II's mistresses, which is a bizarre thought. But again, I cover that in the book. They paid off the Duke of somebody or other in 1850 something, £90,000 to just, don't take any more money from us. And that was one of the problems. The other one was every time there was a war, the British government said, let's put up postal rates. So they did in 1796, 1801, 1805, 1812. That was the peak, 1812. And then the end of the Napoleonic War, they should have put them down. No, they forgot. So they kept the high revenue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you showed earlier stamp 1624 Holland
Yeah,
stamp. Did it have any relationship in its timing to the first colonists moving over to the New World?
that's very interesting. Not as far as I'm aware. I think it's pure coincidence. Again, it was the Dutch government trying to raise money. They were always at war with Britain anyway, and a lot of others around about. So Spain, France, it was a war fundraising effort. And they hadn't previously found a really clever way of taxing legal documents and so on. And this idea came up, and we don't know much about the man or the idea, but it is recorded. And 1624, as far as I know, is the beginning of the tax stamp.
Okay. And were postal rates a problem everywhere? I mean, what was the last place, for example, to shift to the introduction of a postal stamp in order to standardize and make postal rates more efficient?
Last place, I mean, it was a question of ability rather than logic, I think. But I mean, Afghanistan came in very, very late because they didn't have the facilities and the geography was against it. There were other countries that were sort of in denial. Sweden was pretty slow off the mark. They didn't get around to it until 1855. There was a huge rush. The reason I stopped in 1847 was there are very few countries, I've covered nearly all of them, that happened before 1847. But in 1850 and 1851, the whole world really got in on the act. Australia was in there. All the European countries were in there. I guess China would be one of the last because they had, it was the 1860s and the Shanghai Local Post, and then it was later, the 1870s, for the real nationwide stamps. I think the larger the country, the more difficult sometimes to do a nationwide stamp. And certainly Britain was lucky being small. So again, in the book, I have a list of all the dates of all the first issues, but the last one is a difficult one to argue because it's beyond my range date. I think there was some in the 20th century.
Okay. And how was money relayed between the countries to balance postal books, as it were, for international carrying of the mail?
The accountancy system was an absolute nightmare. They had to count all the letters that came in from all the different places. The worst place of all was, of course, in Europe, where there were so many borders and the land borders were all around. So landlocked countries, of which there were a number, such as Switzerland, all letters were going somewhere if they didn't stay in the country. And there were basically agreements. There were great long legal documents on every single one of these things. And they had to count up the number of letters, agree that they'd counted the right numbers, and the letters carry scribbles on them of all the different extra rates, as we saw going through to Indonesia. It depended on the route and the countries in the middle. And I hate to say it, but the French were the worst. They took the most money, as far as I can see. And any rate going through France was always much more expensive. But the actual mechanics, large checks were sent on an annual basis between countries. Somewhere I've seen the figures where a huge check was sent between America and England. And then, of course, they sent one back the other way. And eventually the UPU came along and figured it all out. There was no point because they figured the same number of letters went from A to B as went from B to A. And that was a great relief to everybody because they no longer had to account for anything.
Mm-hmm. One of the attendees is noting, as I know you know, that that Rowland Hill was not the only proponent of postage stamps. Can you talk about a couple of the others that you find important?
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch the beginning.
Other proponents of postal stamps beyond Rowland Hill, other key actors that bear mentioning.
Yeah. So some of the other people involved in the concept and the ignition of the idea, if you like, of postage stamps. I mean, there was a considerable campaign after the event of the son of a chap called James Chalmers, who was arguing with the son of Rowland Hill after both their fathers had passed away. And James Chalmers was a Scotsman and Rowland Hill was an Englishman, a great argument. And again, in the book, I cover a bit of this, that it was a storm in a teacup because they didn't exactly invent it out of space. They just adapted existing revenue stamps. So the Dutchman in 1624, I think, is the guy who invented the stamp. It was then adapted subsequently. Likewise, there is a Venetian aqua AQ letter sheet, which was used in 1600 something, very early on. And that was a sort of a postal stationery. And we've seen the Cavallini letter sheets, they were used. And then there's Australia. Everybody seemed to be able to adapt an existing concept. And nobody invented the stamp overnight. They didn't suddenly wake up. But Rowland Hill published first. He came up with this ridiculous suggestion that if somebody took a letter to the post office for their boss and they themselves didn't have another wrapper to put it in and they'd got the wrong address or something, then they could stick a stamp on the back and write the address. It was a very much of an afterthought for Rowland Hill, but that was in February 1837, and James Chalmers came along in, I think, December 1838. So it was a long time gap after, if they were arguing. But I think we've all grown out of that, and we now realize that it was a worldwide phenomenon with different bits of the jigsaw gradually put together to create the end product.
Can you speak a bit more to the influence of Americans on the British developments and Brits on the American developments?
Yeah, and how many chapters do you want? I've written several on this. It's probably my favorite topic amongst all this stuff, because I've always been interested in the American end of it. And I used to travel there a lot in the 80s and nobody was interested. And so I was running around acquiring things. But essentially, it was two-way traffic, because going way back, I mean, before 1781, before 1776, North America was part of the British sphere of post office influence. So it was a department of the British Post Office. So that was a sort of marriage. And then they split apart, if you like, with the War of Independence, or whatever you want to call it. And subsequently, it was after the War of 1812, of course, things calmed down a little bit. And then there was a lot of American merchants in England, and there were a lot of English merchants in America. And we've mentioned a few of those. And they would go dashing backwards and forwards, bringing their ideas, and nothing was secret. I mean, everybody was quite happy to talk about cheap postage or reduced postage rates. And so there's a whole gamut. I mean, William Dockwra, who invented an early British local post, he had connections to America, and there was Dummer Packets. There were a million different people connected. So later on, it was fun because the American campaign for cheap postage really got going after the British one had succeeded. So when 1840 happened, that's why that Congress document was there. People said, what is going on in England? This sounds really interesting. And they said, we want that over here. Well, it took until 1863 to get the equivalent of penny postage. But along the way, there was Pliny Miles and all these people who were campaigning. And that is a couple of chapters. We haven't got time for all of it, but there was a lot of cross-pollination, let's put it that way.
And having studied all of these postal reformers, are there any personality traits that you found that they all shared, or many of them shared?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think perseverance was the key. If you didn't persevere, you were going to get nowhere. So Robert Wallace, who was the man who sparked off Rowland Hill, he was this Scottish MP. He was so tenacious. He got into Parliament in 1833. Maiden speech was, the post office is rubbish, you know, we need to change it. And that was long before Rowland Hill came along. And Wallace gave Rowland Hill a taxi full of books and references to go away and write his book. That was because of him that book was written. And he was still there all the way through the campaign to 1840 and right through. That was Robert Wallace. Meanwhile, Rowland Hill, I mean, you look at his book, it's full of maths. The guy must have not slept for about a year working on that, reading these huge government reports that he condensed into maths. That's persistent. And the same over in the States. I mean, Joshua Bates and Levitt and people, they were battered by the existing administration. No post office ever wanted to listen to anybody who said, we're not in the post office, but we've got a good idea. Outsiders were not welcome. So I think persistence was the one characteristic, if you're going to do it in the future, you would need.
Is there an abbreviated version of Hill's 73-page pamphlet that you mentioned early in the slideshow that's available for collectors?
Well, there's a couple of reprints of the original that have been done, notably probably in the 1890s, but they are available. One of the editions is available on Google Books, I think, and it's there's 2 or 3 you can get digital versions. If you want to buy an original, they're getting difficult. I mean, it's taken me 40 years to get that original first edition, and I have the first public edition. But I mean, these are only 5 or 6 examples of each edition in private hands, and maybe 10 to 20 of each in the institutions. They are hugely rare things, but a reproduction of it is really good to have, because you should read what he said. And it was very convincing. I mean, he did the maths and he said, look, this is crazy. We're overcharging everybody. If you make them pay when they post it, we save 1 million man hours. It was obvious.
You had mentioned in your book that you were surprised that the British Post Office managed the transition to the penny post surprisingly well, given that many of the administrators in the post office believed that the transition period would be longer. So you showed that 4p marking, for example, in that period turned out to be shorter than they anticipated. The post office must have been fairly successful at some level administratively to be able to carry this out as smoothly as they did. Do you have any thoughts as to how they managed that?
A very interesting point that hasn't really been researched, but they did have a pretty large organization. And it was actually a two-way street, because overnight they had less work to do individually, because they didn't have to knock on doors and collect all the money and add it all up and all that stuff. So that helped. But on the other hand, a huge increase in volume. And coincidentally, my younger daughter is currently a postman here in England. And she'll tell you that with lockdown and Christmas at the moment, it's crazy busy. And they're actually shifting more parcels and the letters are stuck behind. So there's never been enough staff. But in 1840, they'd saved a pile of man hours by going to the prepayment system and the standard weight. You didn't have to count the numbers of sheets of paper in a letter. So all that stuff went. So they coped, because they had more man hours to then apply to delivering, well, twice as many letters overnight.
So they discovered that they liked the changes. That the changes were to their benefit in many cases.
Yeah, it was a balance, but the administrators hated it because they thought they were perfect to start with.
Okay. And in the process of writing these books, did you rediscover anything in your collection?
Rediscover. Oh, God. That's a challenge. You mean an unconsidered trifle that I'd overlooked? And then it became apparent from my study that it was better than I'd thought. Yeah.
Or the reverse, I suppose.
Or the reverse. Yeah, no, that's, I don't recall the reverse, but yeah, I think there were occasions where something suddenly became more important. So it's a bit like the man Southgate. He was a wholesale stationer and he didn't like the Mulready. But I hadn't appreciated until I looked hard that one of the pamphlets that criticized cheap postage in 1839 was produced by him. And he went on to make Mulready caricatures, the cartoons. So he was gunning for postal stationery before it had even been designed. It wouldn't have mattered what design Mulready had come up with. This guy would have shot it down in flames with a cartoon. So that was a light bulb moment, if you like. And the other one was finding out that William Docker had an American connection. I didn't know that. And another one was there's a Frenchman called Piron who was doing postal reform. And I'm still looking for his pamphlet if you've got one.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Several people have asked where to find your book, and it was, you can find it at the Royal Philatelic Society London webpage. And there is somewhere else folks can find the book.
Yeah, I think Leonard Hartman has just got a few copies. Okay. He's the big American book dealer, I believe. I noticed in his newsletter anyway, he mentioned it. So, but the shop online. The problem is the postage, because it's a heavy book, but it's a very pretty book, and it's cheaper than an airfare. Let's put it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much, James. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you for having me.